Thanks very much for gathering. I'm sure that people are still sort of filing in. There are some people kind of still jumping on the webinar, but just kind of getting into a slow start. I wanted to take a second and thank everyone first for coming and joining this conversation. And then second, I guess I should first give a little introduction. My name is Joe Hill, and I'm a producer and shooter with Vice News. And I recently I was recently working with my colleague, Michael Anthony Adams, who was supposed to be on this call, but unfortunately is in transit. He's like on a flight right now, trying to go do another story. So we recently came back from a trip to Somalia, where we did, where we produced a documentary that's been shared around. And so we wanted to gather and take this opportunity to discuss a little bit what, the situation in Somalia, and also some of the takeaways that we learned from doing this reporting. Just kind of a short introduction. I'm really, grateful and happy to be here with the International Crisis Group. And I'm also really proud because, so I'm an ambassador council, or a member of the ambassador council. So like I've seen, all of crisis groups work as an independent organization working to prevent wars and shape policies that build a more peaceful world. So, I think that they have, about 120 staff covering 55 conflicts all around the world. And they're writing reports and policy suggestions and working with, members or, real stakeholders in conflict, as well as the people who have the power to be shaping those conflicts. So it's a really inspiring organization. And so I'm very grateful to be here. And I guess, I wanted to just say that, I think that the reason that we wanted to gather is because there's been, pretty significant changes in both the US and also in Somalia. For us, there's a pretty big monumental moment when, President Trump was leaving office and making sort of some very powerful changes around the world and thinking about, what is the US sort of role in all of these conflicts abroad. And so it's very exciting that we're getting to sort of discuss this. Just as a few more introductions, I wanted to introduce Comfort Arrow, which is obviously the Crisis Group Interim Vice President and African Program Director, an extremely esteemed colleague and someone I'm very honored to be getting to sit with on this panel. And also Steve Pomper, who's the Crisis Group Interim Chief of Policy, who's a former Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at the NSC under President Obama, and also a former State Department lawyer. So we're very glad to have you both on this panel. Lastly, just before we get started, I wanted to say just a little bit about the format of this panel. So we'll start, we can show a little very short snippet of the documentary that we filmed in Somalia that I've been sort of mentioning. And then, we can have maybe about like a 30-minute discussion, some questions that I want to try and bounce off of Comfort and Steve, talk a little bit about what's happening in Somalia, what this, what the US role in that has been, sort of get a bigger view of what all this means. And then I was going to say that as we're going, throughout the entire conversation, if you want to send questions to this Q&A box, in the last 25 minutes of this presentation, we can go through and answer any of those questions, try and sort of shape the way that, direct this conversation in a way that's actually relevant to some of the people who are watching, who I know many of you are also very much embedded or involved in things happening in East Africa or Somalia. So I want to make sure that it's relevant to you and what you are interested in discussing. And then finally, I think it's just important to mention that this is being recorded. So this will all be, the Zoom is being recorded and it's being live streamed on YouTube. And I think that it's going to be available to everyone on YouTube as well once this is complete. So that's kind of nice that, that this discussion can be shared after that. I guess to start, I would like to show just a minute of this documentary, like the very opening, and then I can talk a little bit about what went into making this film.
We're embedded with the Somali Special Forces unit known as Danab. These are U.S.-trained commandos who have just received intel about 2 target houses that are supposedly hiding Al-Shabaab militants. We're heading to the village right now to see if we can arrest these guys. These Danab fighters are Somalia's best weapon against the terrorist group Al-Shabaab. They're rolling out on one of their first operations since their American partners left the country in January. It's the only time journalists have been allowed to film a raid.
Je suis lucky. An extremely relevant advertisement as well after this, war documentary in Somalia. Yeah, I guess basically I just wanted to say that this, to talk a little bit about this film, I think that the reason that Vice put so many resources behind this, and the reason that we were able to actually go and embed with these Danab forces, is because of the moment I was talking about, where the U.S. had been actively involved, or really had troops on the ground, had been participating in airstrikes throughout Somalia for many years at this point. And when Donald Trump announced that he was going to be trying to pull out of, or really end, American endless wars, Somalia seemed like a pretty interesting example of what might happen to a country or to a place when the US were to try and end one of these, end an endless war. What happens when you end an endless war? And so I think Somalia is a very complicated place, and there's a lot of complicated factors involved, including, Al-Shabaab as a particularly complicated foe. I think, the world's many different actors are involved in Somalia and all involved in the same fight. And I think that those things definitely are going to play a big part in what happens in the future. But for us, we really wanted to understand the US engagement and what sort of would happen as a result of pulling out of a war when it wasn't really over. And I think, kind of, maybe this is predictable, or this is pretty journalisty of me to say, but I feel like we ended this process of filming in Somalia with maybe more questions that we started with. We were kind of hoping to have a clear answer as to, like, yes, it's a problem to be pulling out of one of these wars, or yes, it is the solution. The US shouldn't be necessarily intervening in politics all around the world. But I think that in this case, what we found was something that was extremely complicated, where once the US had entered a certain conflict, or once they'd participated so extensively training forces, or, engaging with aerial support in certain ways, I think that kind of support does have some major, it really changes the way that things will continue on the ground. And I think that those ramifications will continue way beyond what the US engagement actually was. So that maybe is what made it an endless war from our perspective, is, once that participation has happened, then it will be everlasting. So I guess just to segue, I think that these are some observations that I made that are, still sort of working through, but for a real on the ground sort of policy perspective, or for a real perspective of what's happening on the ground, I wanted to turn to comfort. And try and get a sense, that Somalia is very complicated. There's a long history of turmoil in the country. I guess I was hoping that you could speak a little bit to what is happening in Somalia on the ground right now, and what is sort of playing into the situation as it is. Just to kind of get a sort of buffer as to the situation.
Thanks, Joe, and it's thanks to Vice for also making this short video. It's a very good way to have sort of a conversation in this 30th year, I should say, since the fall of the Siad Barre government. That's not lost on those of us who've been watching Somalia. I mean, one of my first sort of articles or thesis I had to write at school, at college, was around Somalia. So 30 years on, and it's still very much part of my sort of my life as well. And here we are. Much of the ingredients that led to the collapse of that government back then, 30 years on, are still very much alive. To answer your question as to why we are in the still condition of instability and disorder in Somalia. And the political realities themselves are very much still alive from 30 years on as well. I mean, you asked about, what the current status is, and most of the focus in your film very much speaks to that, is about what to do with Al-Shabaab. And the group is still, although the group, appears diminished today, it's still very much a potent force. It's still very much a potent actor in the country. Its staying power stems from Somalia's weak state weakness. Again, the very basis that led to the collapse of the Saad Berry government. It's a long product of decades of state collapse and war in Somalia, and those factors haven't changed as well. I think the other thing worth noting as well is that those polarized clan politics, there's factionalism within Somali life is still very much alive, despite sort of frequent new attacks by Al-Shabaab. There has been some successes by the government, but the reason why we're still where we are today is because the challenge is that while the government nominally controls population centers, it struggles to protect areas once liberated from sliding again. So how to hold areas once reclaimed, areas captured by the government, this has been the government's weak link as well. And successive governments have been unable to extend their presence further into various areas that they've held. They've failed to be able to deliver basic services. They've failed to stem graft corruption in the country, tasks that have made it more difficult, that have made harder the whole effort to rebuild Somalia. And also, I think what plays into the current dynamics today and the electoral impasse that we have today is the division between relations between Mogadishu and leaders from the regional states as well. So, for example, the recent offensives, for example, by the US, backed up by the US, and Steve will speak to that, and your film talks about that, hasn't dealt Al-Shabaab a blow. Why is that? And we've seen that also in other places, whether it's the Sahel, Lake Chad Basin. The military surge is not the answer. Getting the politics right in the country remains at the heart of the matter. Getting the political settlement right, getting the consensus right between the different elite factions. These are the key issues. We focus obsessively about Al-Shabaab as though Al-Shabaab is the core problem, and yet it's not the priority. The country's deep-rooted political crisis still remains with us, even after you get rid of Al-Shabaab, that crisis will remain. So while defeating Al-Shabaab has been sort of defined as the problem for the country, in fact, it's the politics. It's a central feature of national, regional, international focus. You can't get away from the politics. And I think the answer is the kind of government that is needed, one that is financially secure, with a common vision and with a clear idea of political reconciliation. That is what's needed today in Somalia to be able to turn the corner. And the electoral crisis that you're seeing today, for example, Joe, which is the current reality, I think speaks to that deep political crisis that we have in the country. It speaks also to why we haven't been able to reconcile the country. And I think it's worth noting all your participants on here will know it themselves, that Al-Shabaab didn't emerge until 15 years after the collapse of the Saad Berry regime. It came in the aftermath of the Islamic State, Islamic Court Union. So in a sense, once we're able to get back to the roots of the crisis, which hinges on the socio-political dysfunction of central government, once we've been able to deal with that, then I think we can be able to deal with the more challenging issue around the security of the country. Without getting that right, I think you can't then deal, in a meaningful way with the Al-Shabaab question or any other kind of militant problem in the country.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, because I think that it's something that, and while we were filming your documentary, we were shocked to hear even a representative that we spoke to from SOCOM, from the US Special Forces in Africa. He had said a similar thing where he said, look, like yes, I am the one who's making orders essentially on what we're going to be doing militarily in the country, but there's no way that a military approach is going to be the only thing that's going to work. It's like we have to really depend on all of these other approaches. And I think, Steve, I wanted to turn to you a little bit to talk more about those approaches. I suppose, like when there's a very complicated situation in Somalia. Obviously, there was a massive regime change. There was a slew of conflict that came after the fact. There was an Islamic militant organization that was sort of rising and even taking parts, like massive parts of the country. When Donald Trump announced that he was going to withdraw troops from Somalia, I think a lot of people were shocked because they didn't even know that there were troops in Somalia. It was a problem that, it was something that was really surprising to people. They were like, yeah, we know that there's war in Afghanistan and we know that there's troops in Iraq, but like, what are we doing in Somalia? We never declared war there. What was this approach? I guess, can you talk a little bit about the origin of the U.S. involvement in Somalia? What kind of impacts they made in what ways, and what the result has been, positive or negative about pulling troops or really winding down this military approach in the country.
Still learning how to use my mute button. I'm going to blame Loki. Okay, so first of all, I just want to say thanks to you, Joe, and to Vice for doing this really important work. I really encourage the folks who are in the audience here to take a look at the longer film, which I think does as good a job as any short piece that I've seen, really addressing some of the complexities of the kinds of decisions that are facing the United States at this moment. Comfort spoke of the anniversary of the Barre regime's collapse. It's also an anniversary year for the United States. It's the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks and the launch of what some people refer to as the Forever Wars, which is this sort of massive global counterterrorism campaign that has taken the United States not just to Afghanistan, but to Syria and Yemen and Somalia and other points as well. And I think as sort of looking at the longer film, which folks should take a look at through the eyes of a U.S. official, you see different things. You see those Danab troops who were featured in that short going out with this very worthy mission to counter a brutal enemy and talking about how they've relied on U.S. support to be successful and worrying about what it looks like when the U.S. pulls back. But then, and this didn't come out in the short that we just showed, but you also see the flip side of U.S. engagement, the sort of darker side, which is there's a lengthy discussion with a young 10-year-old girl whose family has effectively been collateral damage in a U.S. air raid, whose home has been destroyed, who's lost a sister, who herself is obviously visibly traumatized. And then there's a conversation with a spokesperson for the U.S. military who's really, I think, trying to, demonstrate a sense of humanity in this conflict and a sense of loss, but also really struggling with not very adequate talking points about how the U.S. manages these kinds of risks and incomplete information and not totally satisfactory answers about U.S. compensation policies and things like that. So if you're, I think, looking at it through the eyes of a former U.S. official, you're pulled in different directions in terms of thinking, okay, well, I mean, obviously we'd like to see Danab succeed, but maybe feeling uncomfortable with the level of U.S. responsibility for what's happened to that young girl's family, and struggling to think about what kind of policy frameworks would put a U.S. military spokesperson in a better position to give better answers to some of those questions. So, as we wrestle with those questions and with the questions that you've just posed, Joe, I thought I would maybe march through a couple of sort of questions that people have about our activities in Somalia, and maybe offer a few quick answers that could be at reference points as we sort of bat this around further in our conversation. So one of them I'll start with is sort of where you just left me, which is how did the U.S. come to be at war with the terrorist group in Somalia? People who are familiar with the U.S. Constitution know that there's a clause in there that says Congress declares wars on behalf of the United States. So did Congress declare a war against Al-Shabaab in Somalia at some point in the last 15 years? And nobody noticed. And the answer is not quite. The US involvement in Somalia is really an offshoot of this broader conflict that started after September 11th. After the September 11th attacks, the US Congress enacted a very broad use of force authorization that granted the executive branch sweeping powers to use force against actors implicated in those September 11th attacks. It didn't name any groups, it didn't name any countries, it didn't include any kind of sunset. And because of this absence of geographic or temporal bounds, the authorization has become the font of what's known as the global war on terror, or the endless wars, or the forever wars. And that interpretation has actually been interpreted even more broadly to encompass groups that have basically been deemed by successive administrations to have come into the fight alongside Al-Qaeda. And that's, or to have splintered off of Al-Qaeda in some cases. So that's how an authorization that was really about the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in the first place, and really focused on Afghanistan, has come to include Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen, or ISIS in Syria and Iraq, or Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Congress never named those groups, and that may be one reason why this has sort of slid under the public's notice. There really hasn't been a public discussion of going to war with Al-Shabaab. Various administrations sort of slid these groups into the authorization, and now the U.S. is at war with them. That's how it worked. So how did Al-Shabaab make this cut? How was there a decision to bring Al-Shabaab under this umbrella? Initially, actually, that wasn't the decision. When the Obama administration started going after terrorist networks as part of its counterterrorism strategy in its first term, it really wrestled with how to look at Al-Shabaab. It treated the top tier of officials basically as almost part of Al-Qaeda because they had sufficient links to the Al-Qaeda core. But Shabaab itself is a big organization. There's some diversity in the group. The motivations, and Comfort could speak to this better than I could, are not always uniform across the group. And it seemed, I think, at the time that there may have been people in the group who didn't even know that there was an affiliation between the leadership and Al-Qaeda. So initially, the whole group was not brought under this sort of global war framework. That changed actually in the second term of the Obama administration, when I think very late in the term, the White House announced that it considered the U.S. to be at war with all of Al-Shabaab. It's a little bit murky, frankly, why it took that decision and whether this was driven by fresh intelligence or new analysis or operational needs or maybe some combination of those things. But the bottom line is that in 2016, it made public that it was taking this step, and that was the situation that it handed over to the Trump administration. Now, another question that might come up is, okay, so the United States is at war with Al-Shabaab. Does that mean it has unlimited authority to use force, bar any other considerations against the group? So I should start by saying crossing the threshold into a war with an organized group like Shabaab unleashes a whole set of consequences. It makes it lawful for the United States military to kill members of that group or detain them on just the basis of their status. If they belong to the group, they're targetable regardless of the threat that they pose. And that's an incredibly far-reaching power. And it can also be a very tricky one to wield when you're in conflict with a non-state actor, which might not be wearing uniforms and which could be trying to blend in with the civilian population. And frankly, the Obama administration worried about this, broadly in the context of its counterterrorism operations, particularly as it expanded them into theaters that are away from Afghanistan and Iraq, where, frankly, you had populations that might not understand why there were US operations happening in their backyard. And there was a real worry, I think, on the part of senior administration officials that these operations could become overcranked, that they had become overcranked in some contexts. They could lead to lots of civilian deaths. That was a humanitarian problem, and it was also, frankly, a reputational problem for the United States. So for these off-battlefield locations, the White House, I think it was in 2013, announced that it was putting a whole new overlay of safeguards on operations in places like Yemen and Somalia. That would involve higher levels of vetting of strikes, bringing a lot of them to the White House for consideration, much more stringent collateral damage thresholds, much narrower criteria for who could be targeted. And I think those safeguards actually had some impact. I think they certainly affected the op tempo, but they could also wax and wane. They could be waived. And because they were discretionary, they could be basically disappeared at the president's direction. And that's basically what happened. Disappeared isn't quite right, but they were certainly eased when the Trump administration came in. And then the Biden administration came back in, and now they seem to have reimposed some of those safeguards. Though the reporting on this isn't totally clear. I mean, it's clear that they've reimposed some. It's not clear which ones they've reimposed. But the big news right now, of course, isn't really just about safeguards. It's about the fact that, as you say, Trump has made this decision to withdraw U.S. troops to bases around the country, and that the Biden team is now sort of wrestling with what its posture in Somalia is going to be, which really brings me to my last question, which is why, after all the work that successive administrations put into creating legal frameworks to justify U.S. action in Somalia, to elaborate safeguards to try and sanitize this involvement to some extent, and given that Al-Shabaab continues to operate there, why is it actually physically pulled troops out of the country, and why is it thinking about potentially even pulling back further? So in answering that, I'll give a heaping caveat that we don't really know where the Biden administration is going to go on this. They're in the midst of a lot of policy reviews that I think will sort of govern the direction of things, and the outcomes from those are not clear. I think those reviews are ongoing. But it is clear that both in the U.S. executive branch and in the U.S. Congress, people are thinking much more seriously about wrapping up some of the strands of the global war on terror than they have in the past. And I think there are a number of reasons for this, and some of them overlap. I think, first of all, this sort of goes back to some of the things that Comfort was saying, there's a mixed sense of fatigue and futility with the reliance on military force as a primary counterterrorism tool and as a tool of U.S. statecraft. I mean, we are, as I mentioned, approaching the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks and frankly, 20 years of continuous war. There's been more than a decade of military activity now in Somalia. And I think there's a growing awareness that if military engagement hasn't resolved certain kinds of crises right now, then it probably won't. And it's a very costly kind of investment to be making in terms of lives and treasure if you have that awareness. Second, I think there's an increasing focus on very narrowly understanding what the U.S. is trying to achieve through the use of force. So what specific threat to U.S. persons or the homeland merits the U.S. dropping bombs, in a context half a world away? And because many of the groups that the U.S. has been fighting have been degraded, and because the U.S. actually has better capabilities for defending itself than it did 20 years ago, I think the answer may be less compelling in the direction of U.S. Engagement abroad through military means than it would have been several years ago. I think third, and relatedly, there's a sense that those resources that have been poured into counterterrorism could probably be fruitfully applied better elsewhere. And there are different ideas about what better means. I think traditional national security types would say pour them into great power competition with China and Russia. I think on the political left, people would say pour them into, fighting climate change and other non-traditional threats like infectious disease. But the bottom line, there is a shared convergence, I think, around the idea that maybe counterterrorism has become an overcrowded priority. Mm-hmm. Fourth, there are issues about U.S. complicity in the kind of carnage that war inevitably brings. That's something that your short highlighted. And the last thing I'll mention is, and this goes to your question about how do we end up here if the U.S. government, a lot of people in the United States don't even know that we're at war in Somalia. There does seem to be a democratic cost, I think, to the U.S. government fighting a war without an explicit congressional approval and the debate and accountability that comes with it. And at a moment when I think a lot of people in the U.S. government are focused on small d democratic restoration, really sort of bolstering our democratic institutions, there's a tension there that I think a lot of people would be much more comfortable if they saw addressed. Okay, I spoke too long, but that's the laydown.
No, I mean, it's fascinating. It's really, really fascinating because I think that's something that has, something that I've wanted to do for a long time in our reporting, and something that we tried to do in some capacity with this film is, we want to try and pull back the curtains a little bit of some of this, this counterterrorism operations that are, especially in the African continent, so secretive. I think that AFRICOM is notoriously secretive when it comes to, military operations. And I think when it comes to drone strikes outside of sort of a declared, theater of war like Afghanistan or in Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq, I think that it's a little bit more complicated and it's harder to get answers about what is legal and what's not. I guess, Comfort, I wanted to ask you a little bit more when we're talking about, first I'll start with drone strikes, but then on a more broad military engagement level, when the US is launching drone strikes in Somalia, I've heard all of the sort of varying perspectives that, it actually is extremely targeted. There is Al-Shabaab is much more limited in what their movements are, the capabilities. I've also heard tons of stories, people who talk about a drone strike is really the number one recruitment tool for many of these insurgent groups. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about these policies militarily, like drone strikes and troops on the ground, and how they really were interpreted and used by Al-Shabaab, if they were effective, if military campaign was useful, or if it's something that, or I guess what the adverse effects may have been if there was some.
Thanks for that question, Joe. I mean, it's a good one because, I think just to step back a little bit and pick up one of the points Steve made. A common thread now that runs through, particularly on the African continent, but we can also extend it to the MENA region, I think, also, whether it's the Sahel, whether it's Lake Chad Basin, what we may potentially see now in Mozambique, although we want Mozambique to learn the lessons from all these other places, Libya as well, is that this so-called use of warfare, military surges, while there is a moment in which to use force, that tool itself doesn't get us out of the problem. And sometimes it may embolden the groups, it may further radicalize the groups, it may also make recruitment of other groups easier, or recruitment from various populations even easier as well. And that is certainly the lesson, whether it's in the Sahel and also in Somalia. And I think while it's clear that Al-Shabaab has felt that military pressure, and while it has been diminished, and there are periods in the history of the group that it has been hemmed in. You saw what happened, for example, in 2011 when Kenya came in for the first time, and Ethiopia, who's always been there, and then also with the US backing up the role of the African mission, AMISOM. So we've seen the utility, but we've also seen that the military response is a double-edged sword as well. We've also seen, and it is one of the telltale signs that we need to rethink our strategy, or that the international community needs to rethink their strategy. And again, and the reason why I'm repeating the Sahel, Lake Chad Basin, Libya, now Somalia, these groups, despite the use of the highest military warfare, what have they all got in common? They've been able to adapt. They've become nimble. They have gone rural. So while Al-Shabaab may have had to retreat from its urban centers, what it's done? It's been able to retreat into rural areas, and it still controls some of those areas that it has, South Central Somalia, for example. It has been able to adapt very quickly to a lot of this military pressure. And at the same time, one thing that has sustained Al-Shabaab, and why all the issues about the rethinking that Steve points to make even more sense today, is that despite all of this militarization of the response, Al-Shabaab still remains financially viable. It is effectively a state within a state. There may be dissensions within the group. There may be factionalism. This is very common in these various groups. There may be different strands. There's one bloc that sees itself as more faithful to Al Qaeda, another sees itself as playing overtures to ISIS, for example. But today, the group appears coherent in the face of a government and politicians that are divided. It is able to provide an alternative governance structure where the state is unable to do that. It is able to provide some semblance of justice, no matter what we think about that kind of justice. It is able to provide some kind of justice, some kind of rule of law, law enforcement capability. In effect, it is a competitor to what we would traditionally see as the state. And that raises a number of questions about what the net effect of this surge of militarism means, because it hasn't necessarily, yes, and even Al-Shabaab has become attuned to the population's reaction. So let me give you a good anecdotal sort of information that Omar, our senior analyst who you spoke to a few weeks ago, give you classic anecdotal evidence about how Al-Shabaab has been able to readjust despite the militarism and the high-tech nature of the militarism. In relation to the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, put out a very clear sort of anti-vaccine message on AstraZeneca, but didn't necessarily block the ability for civilians and populations to go out and get those vaccines. It made the usual comments, the very anti-Western, this is anti-Sharia and all these kind of things. But it's attuned also to its population. It's attuned also to what the population wants, what the population needs. And in a sense, the success of the group in the face of the militarism is that it can define for itself how to respond to the population. It can define for itself, despite all the pressure on it, how to recalibrate itself in various offensive against it. So I think that is why this moment, Steve, that you presented in terms of the US rethinking, and not just the US, there are other actors, I think, also that need to sort of rethink the script for Somalia. That is why I think this is a right moment to be discussing how to now think into the future about the strategy for Somalia. And I really hate to say it, it really is that very simple word about getting the politics right and the settlement right between the various actors in Somalia.
Thank you very much for that. I just looked at the time and I'm thinking that it's a good time to open up to some other questions. Like I know that I'm hoping that there are tons of eager and curious people that are listening right now and want to talk about various things. Just as a reminder, if you wouldn't mind just putting your name and your affiliation in the question too, then it's helpful for us to sort of reference a little bit who's, where these questions are coming from and maybe what perspective. Just to start off, we have a question. I was gonna Steve, I was gonna direct this to you because we talked, especially Comfort was just talking about this is a right moment. We have to start considering the ways that we're dealing with actors like Al-Shabaab, these non-state groups that actually do offer, prospects of, they offer essentially like an alternative to the actual state, who's, a party that many people in the world are trying to negotiate with or trying to state build with. I think that, this question is referring specifically to the comparison between Somalia and Afghanistan. And if, obviously the Taliban and Al-Shabaab have some similarities and some pretty big differences. But can you talk a little bit about lessons that were learned from this withdrawal from Somalia and how that might apply to some of the other conflicts that have really been gripped people's attention throughout the last several decades?
The parallel is really an interesting one. And I would actually flip it a little bit. I think in some ways the US is further along in Afghanistan than it is in Somalia. So the question is more, what can you learn from Afghanistan that applies in the Somalia case? Because in Afghanistan, the US has taken a decision not just to withdraw its forces, but actually strike a peace deal with the Taliban. So that part of the post 9/11 war, at least the plan is, I think, to wrap it up. I don't think the United States is going to be fighting the Taliban anymore unless it has a self-defense reason to do it. And it's hard for me to imagine that if there is a successor version to this 2001 statute that I was talking about, I don't think the Taliban is going to be named as an enemy in it. I think the idea is it's not going to be an enemy anymore. It may not be a group that the United States government particularly admires or wants to see, running things in Afghanistan, but it doesn't threaten. It's not an Al-Qaeda affiliate. It doesn't threaten the United States directly. And so It's not going to be at war with it. Now, the parallel is complicated in this sense. I think the administration's basically suggested they are going to continue to pursue counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan from sort of outside the country. So they're going to, from over the horizon, whatever, aircraft carriers or bases in other countries, to the extent that they need to. They're going to have to figure out what the standard is that might compel them to use force. What level of threat and against who would require, would they feel justified as taking a strike inside Afghanistan after they've pulled all their troops out? I think that's sort of the parallel that they're going to be thinking about in Somalia. So if Al-Shabaab starts to look more like the Taliban, and that they do in some respects, as Comfort was saying, a state within a state that doesn't actually threaten the United States, isn't trying to kill Americans or destroy American property, even in the region, then I think, from the U.S. government's perspective, it's hard for me to see what lens they would put on continuing operations against Al-Shabaab, and then it becomes a question of encouraging some sort of getting to politics, right? As Comfort says, and what kind of role Al-Shabaab plays in that, and how the United States might use its leverage and the reason to try and facilitate that. If Al-Shabaab continues to pose some kind of threat, then I imagine there will be a decision, to use those forces that have been pulled back to Kenya and Djibouti or wherever they are in the region, to continue to manage that threat. But then the question again is going to be, what is it that would actually trigger the United States to want to take a strike? There are different ways you could sort of calibrate that. And again, my guess is that the inclination is going to be, at least I would hope it would be, to make that aperture very narrow, that the threat has to be very specific, and it shouldn't be just against U.S. interests sort of broadly defined, but against a very narrowly defined set of U.S. interests, threats to American people, to the homeland, things like that. And if that happens, you could start to see the op tempo continue to diminish considerably.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm seeing that there's actually been a few questions that have come in on a similar topic. So Comfort, I wanted to send this toward you. I'm going to try and synthesize because there's a few people asking about similar questions. I wanted to ask, a lot of people are keenly aware of the various actors that are in Somalia, and how, the decision for the US to withdraw troops doesn't actually just affect Somalia and the war against Al-Shabaab. It also affects the African Union and their, peacekeeping mission there, AMISOM. It also affects, other actors who are there, the Gulf states, Turkey, China, Russia to some extent. Something I wanted to talk about in our documentary even was that an interesting side note is that the Danab forces were supposed to be 3,000 trained commandos. And at this point, the US has trained about 1,500. Turkey, on the other hand, has a training program in Mogadishu for soldiers and police officers that has already trained 7,000 forces. So, there's one question talking about these external actors is, to what extent do you think that some of them are interested in filling the vacuum that the US has now left? And what does that mean? A sort of, caveat, one question is just asking how those other actors who are there already, those other stakeholders in Somalia, are going to be affected by this decision. I guess I was hoping that you could speak a little bit about who is involved and what these decisions, what the future ramifications of this decision mean for all of those different stakeholders.
Thanks, and that's a good question. I just one point to caveat that, just to say that I wouldn't necessarily say that the US is becoming less of a player in Somalia. I think it's worth qualifying this. I think militarily, the reposition does affect the US standing, but DC, from what I've understood, also just listening to Steve and what we've also understood in the various conversations that we have, is that the US is still a major player and will still be a major player in Somalia, and to be frank, almost by default, because it still does sort of carry some leverage as well. And I also think, to speak to that point, for example, while Al-Shabaab has messaged a bit on the, to the US repositioning, to our surprise, the group has not messaged much on this. And I think they're watching and waiting to see what's going to happen as well. And AFRICOM is still very much in their view, and they're watching and waiting to see what the consequences of this repositioning as well. So and also I think it's worth noting that yes, the US role has lessened in recent years, given that new countries are also becoming more involved in the training, like you mentioned, Turkey in Somalia's security sector. But it's still worth noting that the US is still very much relevant, and also the US incoming US ambassador to Mogadishu, coming back into Mogadishu. There's a transfer of personnel. So that person will still have clout, the most clout of any of his counterweights in the region. So when, for example, whenever the US issues a statement, for example, it generates more traction than others. So I just want to make it clear that we don't necessarily see that the US repositioning itself means of a less of engagement. It will tilt its engagement to other places as well. Having said that, I do think that one of the concerns that we do have going forward is about the role of other external actors. And one of the things that we've emphasized, Joe, in all our work is the need to maintain some kind of cooperation and consensus and coherence between actors who have various interests. And those interests, we have seen them play out in a very negative way in the last 5 years in Somalia. But also it's worth noting that Somalia, while at one level, complains that it's a victim of external interference, the Somali politicians have also been very clever, very pragmatic, and very astute at playing off various regional and external actors as far as the Gulf countries, for example. My own assessment when I talk to my own colleagues is that the regional dynamics are likely to be as intense as the Gulf dynamics going forward this time round. Though my other sense is that the Tigray conflict, the war in Tigray in northern Ethiopia, is likely to prove, in fact, it's already proving distracting for Ethiopia, which has been the regional sort of superpower with a heavy footprint in Somalia, as you know, and also by extension, the other country that was involved in Somalia's security sector reform, a significant regional actor today, Eritrea, too, is distracted because of its own role in northern Ethiopia as well. So that it was the main outlet. It was a main outlet and a significant influencer through the training of the forces. But it's largely today, Eritrea is largely concerned with what is happening in Ethiopia. We can delve also the other, when I look at the other question here about the role of the region, the other country, of course, of significance is Kenya. And as we speak, that tension between those two countries and what it may mean for the elections still remains up in the air. Essentially, though, I think in the short term, around the elections and with Farmajo still in power, it's going to be very difficult to get a meaningful relationship between Kenya and Somalia, but things are pretty tense. So if you're looking to the region also to influence, shape, rethink, and provide some kind of political framing of the issues, that's going to be a challenge. I think the other critical actor in this story, Joe, is the African Union. Now, as you know, it took the good decision to deploy an envoy in the form of the former head of state of Ghana, that was eventually blocked by Farmajo. As you know. So the AU has tended to provide some kind of military and political umbrella, some kind of coherence, continental coherence. But this latest action by Farmajo raises questions about the future relationships between the AU and Somalia. Although I will say that in the context of the electoral impasse, the AU was able to broker an agreement just last week with the international community, insisting that Somalis go back to the drawing board and negotiate, begin to negotiate a path towards elections after the fiasco that we saw early on. But one thing I do want to say about the region and the Gulf, and I think it's worth all of us paying attention to is that the dividing line in the Horn and the Gulf, even post the January GCC declaration, Steve, you remember the GCC declaration, we wondered what that would mean for Somalia, but that dividing line still remains strong, and what it means for Somalia really remains unclear, because even before the spat, the crisis between Qatar and UAE, even before that, the two countries were very divided in terms of their own activities vis-a-vis Somalia. So I'm not sure that we're totally out of the woods in terms of Gulf different interests in Somalia and how that plays out in the elections. And if we're going to see a repeat of what we saw in the last elections, or whether the Somalis themselves will isolate themselves from this continual interference. But that, for me, Joe, is why the key takeaway is for Somalia's international partners need to, and we've emphasized it, need to present a united front so that they don't undermine themselves, and also they're not played off or play off the various Somalia actors, which has sort of been the history of international relations in Somalia. And I think a sense of unity will be very helpful right now to stop those negative actions and to also sort of negate and deal with the meddling that we're seeing, particularly from those nearer to Somalia and even those across the waters in the Gulf region as well. And just also, your question asked about AMISOM. It's worth noting that the AMISOM mandate is going to end at the end of this year. So so it becomes now crucial in terms of what exactly we're handing over in terms of the Somali National Army and what does that look like. I think that is going to be preoccupying the minds of various international actors going forward.
You set up exactly my next question. And the truth is, I'm not sure who would like to speak to this, Steve, if this is in your wheelhouse or comfort, if you want to answer this as well. I was going to say that I see we only have a few more minutes, so I just want to, maybe this time we'll start rapid firing some questions so I can get through. There's so many interesting things people are sending our way. One question was about, essentially someone asked, Dave Jessar said, how worried should we be about the Somali security sector potentially being a source of instability, given the events of April in Mogadishu? And also he mentioned the looming threat of AMISOM's withdrawal as well. So I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about, how serious are these threats of, the security forces themselves? Like, what are the threats in Somalia besides Al-Shabaab as well, and how seriously should we be taking those things?
That's an excellent. I mean, I think that just goes back to what I said at the beginning, and thank you very much, Dave, for answering that. And in a sense, you sort of the question you pose suggests that you already know the answer yourself. I mean, exactly what we saw in April. It wasn't Al-Shabaab who came storming into Mogadishu following that electoral impasse crisis. These were fighters, forces linked to various opposition groups and Farmajo forces, who stared down each other in April and who clashed. And Al-Shabaab pragmatically sat back and watched. It didn't need to do anything. So I think this goes back to what I was saying, that even if you remove Al-Shabaab from the scene, in the end, while defeating Al-Shabaab has been a central feature of national, international, regional action, take Al-Shabaab out of the equation, and the problems that first led to the crisis 30 years ago, that led also to a crisis post 2005, 2007, 2011, 2014, they speak to that division, that factionalism, that the breakdown of clan politics, the breakdown of elite consensus, the breakdown of relationships with Somalia elites. I mean, it's at the heart of it, is defining what the vision of Somalia looks like. At the heart of it is understanding what does a political settlement look like. Whoever wins the election Joe, when we finally get around that, their biggest challenge will be how to begin to reconcile the country, how to begin to govern, how to ensure that the country is representative of the population. Somali politicians, Somalis are still divided as to what the political system framework will look like that governs their country. And for so long as that remains at the heart of the crisis, groups like Al-Shabaab and what you saw in April will continue to happen. You will get, these forces beginning to sort of, arrive into Mogadishu and begin to take stands and divide themselves, back up their opposition, and continue to fight against one another. I mean, it's just so different, elephants competing for the same space for the same price as well. And for me, Al-Shabaab is a symptom of this and not a cause of the dilemma that we're facing in the country today.
Thanks so much for that. Steve, I have another question that's coming from Gautam Chatterjee. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced his name. I read quickly. I was going to say that the real question here is the U.S. government contemplating the possibility of dialogue with Al-Shabaab in the future? I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more seriously about, like, if that contemplation is real, what that would look like. Also, maybe what it would mean for so many different countries to have invested heavily into the creation of the Somali state, and then to seek, then to maybe turn to another state actor or state builder that would be Al-Shabaab, what that means.
I mean, I don't know what the U.S. government is talking about right now. I think this goes a little bit back to the question of the parallels between Afghanistan and Somalia. If the U.S. government wants to live in a world where it doesn't have to manage these kinds of threats through, constant force projection, and I don't think it does want to live in that world ultimately, then it's going to have to get creative about the kinds of diplomatic solutions it's willing to entertain. And it took forever for the U.S. government to come to the conclusion that it was ready to sit down in a serious way and broker a deal with the Taliban, but it eventually crossed that threshold. I think it's yet a further step to have that, to contemplate doing that with a group that, has basically branded itself an Al-Qaeda affiliate. It's sort of a category apart. But at some point, and this is something, Crisis Group has written about, thinking about how you would talk to the bad guys and how those negotiations would proceed and what you might be able to get out of it is something that players in Somalia and other places where these jihadist groups are active is something that's a bridge that people are going to want to think about crossing at some point, I think.
Thanks a lot for that. I feel like this might be the last question, unfortunately. So I'm trying to synthesize one more time. There's a few different questions that talk about the sort of root cause of some of these conflicts or the real tension in Somalia. So Comfort, I think I'll maybe let you bring us home with this. There's a few questions talking about this root cause. You talked about financial stability, and if there's something that, if there's a way of addressing that. And also, there's a focus on, let me rephrase this. There's several questions talking about financial stability in the country, but also how Al-Shabaab is using, the justice system and also religion as a tool for keeping people involved. I was curious if you could touch on some of these root issues that are keeping people, I don't know how to synthesize all these questions. There's so many different things I'm trying to put together. So what I will say is this. There are some root causes to the instability in Somalia. Some of it is, seeking other state actors to provide state services like religious services or justice. Some of it's financial. Some of it just has to do with weak political institutions. So looking at Somalia, what are some of the things that you think are most urgent that need to be incorporated to address some of these root issues? Like what's really at the top of your agenda looking forward for Somalia?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think one of the, I spoke about sort of political reconciliation and, re-looking at issues around, the Constitution, and also looking at the relationship between Mogadishu and the regional states, the federal regional states. But Joe, if you look at, what sparked the latest round of crisis in the country, I think one of the biggest challenges right now is how to rebuild the trust that was broken down, especially in relation in the way in which Farmajo sort of handled the whole electoral process as well. So, this period, this like 6 months period, or since January, if you want, I mean, it has been characterized by a high degree of distrust, as the basic rules could not be agreed upon. So this led to a breakdown of elite consensus, and this provoked frustration about the style of governance that was seen from Farmajo, centralizing, taking decisions unilaterally. So in a sense, first, rebuilding the breakdown of that relationship that led to the clash, and then getting back, now that we're moving ahead, making sure that we stick to this, the September 17th agreement that ultimately laid the basis for the elections is crucial. Although I think that agreement needs to be broadened out from the original sort of signatories to now include wider society, civil society, because it was very much a narrow Somalia political elite that was behind this agreement. But again, I mean, I hate to continue to repeat myself, but the kind of government that is needed for us to begin to see, for Somalia to begin to see its way out of this crisis, one that is financially secure with a common vision and cohesive means to back that up, seems very unlikely to materialize in the near future. For that reason, Al-Shabaab will continue to thrive if we don't begin to sort of lay out what that political settlement looks like. And if we can't begin to put in place the various provisions. I mean, when you look at the history of abuse, of violence, of human rights and sexual abuse committed by Al-Shabaab, you also have to pause and ask yourself that despite these years of atrocities, that the population of Somalia itself is very distrustful of the men in civilian clothes. They're very frustrated, annoyed, and so they've seen that the alternative. They've looked at Al-Shabaab, who's, in the end, it's a Somali organization rooted in Somalia, regardless of its external tentacles. And I think, to go to Steve's point, any serious conversation about engagement needs to engage Al-Shabaab, not just as a militant group or insurgent group, but one that has a governance structure and one that is a political actor as well, if we're going to overcome this crisis. But it is not the only priority in Somalia. It is again, get rid of Al-Shabaab, but the defects, the problems, the reasons why we here in the beginning are still very much the mainstay of the country, sadly. And that's an unfortunate way to end. And I don't want to end on that note. I think there is a way out. I think the agreement that came last week to get back onto the path to the elections itself is one that everybody needs to back, and to make sure that we deliver that elections and then begin the hard task of how to reconcile the politicians and the population again, before you deal with all those administrative structure leadership issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I just want to say, I know that we've kept everyone a little bit long. So thank you all for sticking with it and for, hearing us talk about Somalia. I know that it's not always the first place on everyone's priority, but like, I really think that something that I took from this documentary was just how important it is that we talk about this place and the situation that's unfolding there and how many people are involved. So Steve and Comfort, you guys are so cool. And I'm so glad that I got to be on this panel with you. It was really, really awesome getting to meet you. And thank you all for sticking around for this panel. I hope that you take the chance to watch the film when we're finished.
Joe, thanks for your expert moderation, and thanks to everybody for joining.
Yeah, and thanks again to Vice for the excellent video. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks guys. All right, we'll talk